Imagine waking up tomorrow morning and you have just been completely stripped of your entire personality. Like, you cannot make a sarcastic joke. You can't articulate your political philosophy.
Right.
You literally cannot explain the nuances of your career, your passions, or even your personal history. You're just reduced to pointing at objects, nodding, and acting with the communicative complexity of a toddler.
Which is terrifying, honestly.
It's an agonizing, profoundly humbling scenario, but that is the daily reality of an adult language learner. It is an absolute intellectual vulnerability trap. So, welcome to the deep dive.
Glad to be here.
Today we are focusing on a single document, but it's one that will, fundamentally alter how you view your own brain, the invisible architecture of your native tongue, and the incredibly calculated science of teaching human beings to communicate. We are looking at an official instructional document. It's simply titled English Guide Abilities Cannot, Lesson 60.
And we should probably establish right immediately that we are not analyzing some advanced, postgraduate linguistics syllabus here.
No, not at all.
This is a curriculum designed specifically for level A1 learners.
Yeah.
Absolute beginners. Individuals who are operating from a baseline of 0 in the English language, which is exactly what makes the document such an incredible artifact.
Right.
Because when you strip away the complexities of advanced vocabulary and complex syntax, you're just left with the raw mechanics of cognitive load management. The creators of this curriculum, they aren't just teaching vocabulary, they're playing a highly sophisticated, high-stakes game of neurological chess with the learner's brain.
Yeah, we are essentially deconstructing the psychological blueprints used to build a human persona from scratch. Because looking at beginner language materials forces us to see our own language, the tool we wield every single day with unconscious ease through completely objective, almost alien eyes. Okay, let's unpack this, because the opening move in this neurological chess game is utterly fascinating.
It really is. And it actually starts before the lesson even begins with these bizarre internal meta notes.
Oh my gosh, yes. The internal notes. I'm so glad you brought that up, because it completely sets the tone.
All right, so at the very top of the document, there's this section labeled Strict Instruction for Hosts. And it's not for the student, it's a system check. It literally says, executing mandatory cleanup, deleting all audio files for Lesson 58 Coffee Shop to maintain storage space.
Which is just such a wild thing to leave in a curriculum document. It's like seeing the code behind the matrix. They're telling the system, clear the hard drive. We are ready to record lesson 60.
Exactly. But it gets even more granular in the next note, which is the role and voice configuration. They are programming the exact delivery specs for the two hosts of the lesson, Anna and Lukas.
Yes. Host 1, Anna, is a female voice, and the document dictates she must be Studio C, speed 0.9, pitch plus 1.5. And her tone is specifically directed to be encouraging, but very honest.
And then you have host 2, Lukas, the male voice. He's Studio B, speed 0.85.
Yeah.
And his tone is supposed to be this overly confident superstar attitude at first, and then humbled and embarrassed later.
Okay, wait, I want to pause on that because the precision there is wild. Speed 0.9 for Anna and speed 0.85 for Lukas. Why are they explicitly downshifting the speed of normal human speech?
Because of the cognitive load we mentioned earlier. The document explicitly notes this under pace and atmosphere. It says to speak extra slowly because the content is longer, so the pacing has to remain relaxed for A1 learners. If you play audio at a normal 1.0 conversational speed for an absolute beginner, it doesn't sound like individual words.
It just sounds like a wall of noise.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's a phonetic blur. By artificially slowing Anna to 0.9 and Lukas to 0.85, they are giving the learner's brain these micro-milliseconds of processing time between syllables. It's an acoustic crutch. And notice they also have a mandatory pronunciation tip. Clearly emphasize the strong can and the sharp T in can't.
Right, so beginners can actually hear the difference between positive and negative abilities. Because in fluid English, native speakers swallow the T in can't all the time. We say, I can't go, and it sounds almost identical to I can go if you aren't paying attention.
Precisely. They are hyper-articulating to prevent failure. And that level of control bleeds right into the mandatory opening they script out.
Oh, the mandatory opening is so good. Anna has to start. The document is very firm on that. Anna must start, and she says, hello, everyone. Welcome to Lesson 60. We have a very special talent show for you today. But first, subscribe to our channel.
And then Lukas jumps in, hi, guys. Yes, subscribe. I am Lukas the superstar. I can do everything.
And Anna hits back with, we will see about that, Lukas. Grab your notebooks, everyone, and get ready to pause, write, repeat.
That phrase, pause, write, repeat, is the perfect transition into the actual curriculum. Because once the system check is done, the document moves into segment 1, talent vocabulary. The overarching concept is presented to the learner as the fun things people learn how to do.
Yeah, and out of the hundreds of thousands of words in the English lexicon, they give the learner exactly 6 action verbs to start with, just 6. The foundational starter pack is sing, dance, swim, cook, play the guitar, and speak English.
It is a surgically curated spectrum of human action. The immediate question it raises is, why prioritize these specific 6? If you're engineering a survival kit for a brand new language environment, the instinct might be to focus strictly on biological imperatives.
Right.
You'd expect to see verbs like walk, eat, sleep, or perhaps drink.
Yeah, the purely utilitarian functions. Like, if I'm dropped in a foreign country, my very first panic is about how to acquire food and find a place to sleep. But instead of eat, the curriculum just hands the learner play the guitar and dance, which initially seems, I don't know, entirely counterintuitive for survival.
It does seem counterintuitive until you examine what the adult language learner is actually suffering from. Yes, eat and sleep are fundamental, but they don't differentiate you as an individual. Every single biological organism eats and sleeps.
Right, there's no personality in eating.
Exactly. The A1 learner isn't just suffering from a lack of biological utility. They are suffering from that crisis of identity erasure we just talked about. This specific vocabulary list is an exercise in identity construction. It provides the building blocks for an adult to start reclaiming their individuality.
That concept of identity construction instantly makes me think of the character creation screen in a complex role-playing video game.
Oh, that's a great comparison.
Because when you boot up a new RPG, right before you ever step foot into the game world, you are presented with a blank slate. You're given a finite number of skill points to distribute into different stats. Are you going to pour your points into physical strength or magical ability or, charisma? You are defining the parameters of who you will be in this new reality. And the curriculum here is basically handing the learner 6 basic stats to define who they are in this new English-speaking universe.
Building on that gaming analogy, the specific stats offered here cover a really brilliant psychological spread. You have swim and cook. These are the grounded, practical survival traits. They tether the learner to physical autonomy.
Yeah, because cooking implies providing sustenance, and swimming implies navigating and surviving the physical environment.
Right. They are the baseline markers of a capable, independent adult.
But humans require more than just mere capability to feel human. We need expression.
Which is exactly where sing, dance, and play the guitar come in. These represent the artistic and cultural dimensions of the human experience. They allow the learner to communicate, I'm not just a survival machine. I am a creative entity. I have culture. I experience joy.
Yeah.
When you are isolated in a new linguistic environment, the ability to signal that you possess cultural or artistic skills is a massive shortcut to social connection.
And the choice of play the guitar is wonderfully tactical, I think. They could have easily used play an instrument or make music, but giving the learner a concrete, universally recognized physical object, like a guitar, it provides an immediate visual anchor.
It does.
You can instantly picture someone holding a guitar. It tethers the highly abstract concept of musical proficiency to a tangible prop, which must significantly lower the mental friction of memorizing the phrase.
It absolutely reduces the cognitive load. The brain doesn't have to process the abstract category of instrumentation. It just conjures the mental image of the wooden object and the strings. And then we arrive at the 6th verb, which is speak English.
The ultimate meta skill.
It is entirely self-referential. Speak English is the overarching cognitive mountain the learner is currently attempting to climb. By embedding it within the starter pack of talents, the curriculum gives the learner the exact vocabulary required to articulate the very struggle they are engaged in.
It almost functions as a self-fulfilling prophecy, doesn't it? You are learning the vocabulary so that you can eventually, triumphantly, deploy the phrase, I can speak English. It's aspirational architecture.
That's a great way to put it.
So we have this beautifully balanced 6-piece toolkit. The learner can define themselves as the practical survivor who cooks, the life of the party who dances, the creative soul who plays guitar, or the dedicated student learning English. But possessing the vocabulary is really only step one.
Right.
To actually wield these identity markers, the learner requires a mechanical framework. They need the grammatical connective tissue. And that introduces us to a notorious psychological hurdle in beginner English.
Yeah, we are moving from the philosophy of identity into the rigid mechanics of syntax here. The document introduces the modal verb can as the delivery mechanism for these new skills. But the curriculum designers dedicate the vast majority of this section not to explaining what can means, but to violently warning the student about how not to use it. The text practically leaps off the page with this massive explicit directive. The rule of can means no to.
The visual cues used here are incredibly stark. Like the document literally prints out the sentence, wrong, I can sing, and places a massive aggressive red X next to it. Immediately below, it prints, correct, I can sing, alongside a bright green check mark. It does the same for the negative forms, mapping out cannot and can't. But the sheer visual violence directed at the word to is striking.
It really is.
When I look at that red X, I feel an immense wave of empathy for the learner because English has essentially set a trap for them.
Well, consider the structural context the learner has built up to this point.
Exactly that. Up until lesson 60, the English language has relentlessly trained this learner to use the word to as the essential bridge between verbs. If a learner desires something, they've been drilled to say, I want to sing. If they enjoy an activity, it's I like to sing. If they're expressing an obligation, it's I need to sing. The brain has synthesized a highly reliable, comforting structural formula, verb plus to plus action. And then, the very second the learner wants to articulate their actual ability, the language just changes the locks on the doors. Suddenly it's a modal verb, and the word to is entirely illegal. The sentence, I can't sing, earns you that giant red X.
What's fascinating here is that you're describing the collision between a perfectly functioning brain and a highly illogical linguistic system. In cognitive psychology, what the learner is doing when they say, I can to sing, is called overgeneralization.
Overgeneralization.
Yeah. The human brain is, at its core, a pattern recognition engine. It constantly seeks to optimize energy by finding rules and applying them universally. When the A1 learner initially discovers the want to, need to, like to pattern, their neurological pathways solidify that structure. The brain thinks it has cracked the fundamental code of English verb combination.
Because based on the empirical evidence they've gathered so far, that is the only logical conclusion.
Precisely. The error is actually a symptom of successful learning. The brain is abstracting a mathematical rule and projecting it forward. The problem is that human languages are not mathematically pure. They are the messy, chaotic result of thousands of years of historical accidents and cultural collisions.
Yeah, English is basically 3 languages wearing a trench coat.
Exactly. And the modal verbs operate on a completely different historical architecture. So the curriculum designers are confronted with a massive pedagogical roadblock. They can't simply teach a new rule. They have to actively dismantle an old, highly successful, heavily reinforced rule. They must engineer what is known as pattern disruption.
Pattern disruption, you are actively fighting the ghost of a previous success.
And that biological reality dictates the aesthetic design of the document. When a student makes an error born from overgeneralization, gentle, subtle corrections are practically useless. If a teacher casually notes, oh, just a quick thing, we actually say I can sing without the to, the student's brain will frequently treat that correction as auditory noise.
Wait, really? It just ignores it?
Yes, the established to pathway is so thick, so heavily myelinated, that the brain essentially gaslights itself. It assumes it misheard the teacher because the internal rule is deemed more reliable than the external correction.
The brain's prediction engine overrides the actual sensory input to protect its favorite pattern. That is wild. Exactly how do you break a pattern that resilient?
You have to deliver a cognitive shock. You need absolute, unavoidable, high-contrast clarity. The explicit, blunt visual of the red X next to I can to sing forces the brain to halt its predictive engine. It highlights the friction. It creates a state of cognitive dissonance that signals to the basal ganglia and the cortex, the universal rule you rely on is fundamentally broken in this specific environment. You must build a new pathway.
If we connect this to the bigger picture and look at the broader human experience, think about how profoundly this applies to you, the listener, in your own professional or personal life. How often do we face massive internal resistance simply because a new system we're attempting to adopt subverts the mechanics of a system we've already mastered?
Oh, all the time.
Unlearning a sensible functioning pattern requires infinitely more cognitive calories than learning a brand new concept from a blank slate. You see this constantly when an entire company is forced to migrate to a new project management software, or when you get a new executive director who demands reports formatted in a way that actively contradicts the previous administration. The primary source of your frustration isn't the complexity of the new software. The friction is your own brain screaming that the old pattern was more efficient.
The cognitive load of unlearning is immense. The friction is a biological reality. And the architects of this A1 curriculum are acutely aware that analytical warnings, even vivid ones like a giant red X, have a short half-life. A grammar rule is dry. It exists in the prefrontal cortex, which is easily fatigued by stress, lack of sleep, or anxiety. If they want this counterintuitive no-do rule to survive the chaos of actual conversation, they can't rely on analytical memory alone. They have to anchor the data in the emotional centers of the brain.
They need to bypass the spreadsheet and build a memory palace, and they execute this by abruptly pivoting the curriculum into a highly theatrical narrative.
We enter the realm of narrative pedagogy.
The document enthusiastically introduces a section titled Storytime. This is the moment the dry instructional manual transforms into an interactive play. We meet our two protagonists, Anna and Lukas. The scene is set with Anna peacefully playing the guitar in her living room. Suddenly, Lukas enters, and the text provides a very specific, absurd detail.
The sunglasses.
Yes. Lukas walks into the living room wearing sunglasses. Indoors, he immediately announces, "I'm a superstar. I have many talents."
Which ties perfectly back to his voice configuration we saw at the start. Speed, 0.85, overly confident superstar attitude. It's an incredibly efficient way to establish the character archetype and tone.
But what is truly captivating here is the meta text. The document contains an explicit capitalized instruction directed solely at the educators facilitating the lesson. It dictates, instruction for hosts. Read very slowly. Make the story highly expressive. Lukas should sound very confident until he messes up.
That directive is the linchpin of the entire pedagogical strategy.
Yeah.
It is not a suggestion for making the class more entertaining. It is a critical mechanism for information delivery.
I found that directive so compelling. Why does a foundational language curriculum demand that the instructor suddenly become a theater actor?
We have to view this through the lens of the A1 learner's auditory experience. When an absolute beginner listens to a paragraph of spoken English, they are not hearing distinct, isolated words. They are hearing a continuous, overwhelming stream of phonetic noise. They might recognize perhaps 15 or 20% of the vocabulary.
Right.
If an instructor reads that story in a flat, clinical, monotone voice, the learner's cognitive bridge collapses the instant they encounter an unknown word. The context just evaporates.
Because the words themselves are the only data stream, and that stream is fundamentally broken.
Exactly. But if the instructor obeys that directive, if they become highly expressive, modulating their tone, cadence, volume, and utilizing exaggerated facial expressions and body language, they're simultaneously broadcasting a massive secondary stream of paralinguistic data.
Wow.
The student's prefrontal cortex might not know the dictionary definition of superstar or talents, but when the instructor puffs out their chest, tilts their head back, wears an arrogant smirk, and projects a booming, confident voice, the student's mirror neurons instantly decode the universal human concept of hubris and overconfidence.
The physical performance literally becomes the translation. The emotion bridges the cognitive gap where the vocabulary fails.
It is the essence of paralinguistic communication, and it leads directly into the psychological utility of the character of Lukas.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Let's examine the narrative function of Lukas. He is a walking caricature of unearned confidence. The indoor sunglasses, the bragging about his immense talents. He specifically claims he can sing and dance. Anna, playing the role of the skeptic, calls his bluff. She challenges him. "Okay, superstar, show me. Sing a song."
The curriculum is deliberately winding up a spring of narrative tension.
And the release of that tension is spectacular. The text describes the moment Lukas attempts his vocal performance. He opens his mouth and sings as loudly as possible. The curriculum explicitly describes the sound as terrible, comparing it to a dying cat.
A dying cat.
A dying cat. And the physical reaction is just as extreme. Remember Anna's voice profile? She's supposed to be encouraging but honest. Well, she literally has to cover her ears to block out the noise. She shouts at him to stop delivering the brutal verdict. "You cannot sing. You are terrible."
It is a profound, unambiguous failure.
The imagery of comparing an adult singing to a dying cat in a formal curriculum is wonderfully unhinged. It is high comedy. It's like watching someone slip on a banana peel, but with linguistics. Lukas confidently stepped up to the microphone, and his entire persona instantly shattered.
But we must ask the pedagogical question. Why leverage failure as the teaching mechanism? Why not design a story where Lukas sings a beautiful aria, Anna applauds, and they reinforce the positive, I can sing?
Yeah, wouldn't positive reinforcement create a more encouraging learning environment? Like, keep everyone feeling good.
It might be more pleasant, but pleasantry is remarkably forgettable. From an evolutionary neuroscience perspective, the human brain is hardwired to prioritize and encode high-emotion, high-stakes events. The amygdala, which processes emotional responses, acts as a highlighter pen for the hippocampus, where memories are formed.
Okay, so the amygdala flags it.
Right. When we experience humor, shock, or secondhand embarrassment, the amygdala floods the system with neurochemicals that signal to the hippocampus, this data is critical for survival. Burn this into long-term storage.
So an average successful interaction is discarded as background noise, but a catastrophic, embarrassing failure is permanently archived.
Precisely. If Lukas sings beautifully, the learner smiles and forgets the scene 5 minutes later. By engineering a spectacular failure, by utilizing the visceral auditory metaphor of a dying cat and the physical action of Anna covering her ears, the curriculum binds the target grammar to an emotional spike.
That makes so much sense.
The mechanical, somewhat confusing structure of cannot sing without the two is now neurologically glued to the vivid, hilarious image of a wildly arrogant man publicly humiliating himself. It creates a robust, multisensory memory anchor.
And the curriculum designers know that one anchor isn't enough to secure the concept. They double down. Lukas, having been thoroughly humbled, removes his ridiculous indoor sunglasses. He is visibly sad. He admits defeat practicing the target grammar. Okay, I cannot sing. But the human ego is resilient. He immediately attempts to reclaim his dignity. He pivots rapidly, declaring, "But I can cook. I am a great chef," and he sprints into the kitchen.
This transition launches the second act of the narrative, which fundamentally alters the stakes of the lesson.
It's a massive escalation. We enter the segment of this story focused entirely on the kitchen disaster. Lukas claims culinary mastery and disappears into the kitchen. The text provides a cinematic time jump. 5 minutes later. And then absolute chaos erupts. The fire alarm triggers. The document specifically spells out the auditory intrusion. Beep, beep, beep. Thick black smoke billows out of the kitchen. Anna runs in, screaming in panic that the food is burning. Lukas is physically coughing from the smoke inhalation. It has morphed from a slightly embarrassing talent show into a legitimate domestic emergency.
The deliberate acceleration of sensory input here is a masterclass in instructional design.
Okay, but let me push back on this slightly because the leap in intensity feels almost jarring. We go from a guy with a bad singing voice to a scenario where the house is literally filling with black smoke and fire alarms are blaring. For an A1 beginner's lesson, isn't this level of dramatic escalation a bit much?
It seems like a lot.
Right. Couldn't the designers have demonstrated his failure by having him simply burn a piece of toast or maybe accidentally put salt instead of sugar in the coffee? Why jump straight to arson?
Well, consider the cognitive ambiguity of minor mistakes. If the curriculum simply had Lukas oversalt a bowl of soup, the A1 learner's brain might interpret the scenario with nuance. They might think, well, he made a mistake with the seasoning, but perhaps he can still cook basic meals. Or they might interpret the phrase cannot cook to mean is not a Michelin star chef. When you are establishing foundational negative vocabulary, nuance is your enemy.
So a mild failure creates a fuzzy, subjective definition of the word cannot.
Absolute beginners require absolute stark contrasts. A blaring fire alarm, billowing black smoke, choking and coughing. These are universally recognized primal indicators of total catastrophe. By escalating the narrative to an emergency, the curriculum brutally and perfectly defines the absolute negative state of the verb. It leaves zero margin for misinterpretation. Cannot cook does not mean needs improvement. In this context, it equates to total inability and danger.
That structural logic is impeccable. And the integration of the onomatopoeia, the explicit beep, 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 serves a similar universal function, right?
Oh, absolutely. Onomatopoeia is one of the most powerful tools in early language acquisition because it entirely bypasses linguistic processing. The sound of a shrill alarm does not need to be translated. It taps directly into the brainstem's acoustic startle reflex. It engages the auditory imagination, forcing the learner to mentally simulate the chaotic environment.
And the specific detail of the smoke. The text doesn't just say smoke. It specifies black smoke. White smoke might just be a boiling pot. Black smoke signifies chemical combustion. It signifies ruin. So Lucas has now catastrophically failed at artistic expression, the singing and fundamental survival, the cooking. He is standing in a ruined kitchen, coughing through the black smoke, and he finally capitulates completely. He looks at Anna and says, "Okay, Anna, you are right. I cannot sing and I cannot cook." His persona is entirely demolished.
And from a narrative standpoint, ending the story here would be profoundly discouraging. The curriculum has successfully taught the negative grammar, but it has left the protagonist in a state of utter defeat.
Which brings us to the psychological resolution of the scene. The smoke is clearing, Lucas is coughing and defeated, and Anna does something deeply empathetic yet complex. She laughs. The text implies it isn't a cruel, mocking laugh, but a release of the intense situational tension. And then she throws him a conceptual lifeline. She smiles and says, "But you can speak English, Lucas, and that is great."
This specific line of dialogue is arguably the most sophisticated psychological maneuver in the entire curriculum.
I want to explore the mechanics of that because on a surface reading, it just feels like a tidy, wholesome way to wrap up the narrative and check off the final vocabulary word from our initial starter pack. It feels like a standard sitcom ending.
It operates on a much deeper neurological level, and to understand it, we have to look at Stephen Krashen's theory of the affective filter.
The affective filter, how does that mechanism work in the context of learning?
So, Krashen hypothesized that a learner's emotional state acts as a literal biological filter that determines whether new linguistic information can be processed by the language acquisition device in the brain. If a student's experiencing high anxiety, low self-esteem, or a profound fear of making errors, their affective filter is triggered.
Okay.
Biologically, this means stress hormones like cortisol are flooding the system, which actively impairs the hippocampus and prevents the encoding of new memories. The brain shifts into a defensive self-preservation mode. No matter how brilliant the curriculum is, the language bounces off a wall.
That is a terrifyingly relatable biological reality. Like, if you feel stupid in a meeting or if you feel judged in a classroom, you literally stop absorbing information. Your brain shuts the intake valves to protect your ego from further damage.
Exactly. Conversely, when a student feels relaxed, validated, and confident, the affective filter lowers. The cortisol levels drop, dopamine facilitates synaptic plasticity, and the brain becomes highly receptive to new patterns. Now apply this biological reality to the adult A1 learner engaging with Lesson 60. They are navigating the humiliation of lost identity, they are battling the deeply confusing no-to-o grammatical trap, and their baseline anxiety is likely peaking. Their affective filter is fully deployed.
So how does Anna's laughter in the conclusion of the story manipulate the learner's neurochemistry?
He utilizes a psychological concept called downward social comparison. The narrative has systematically constructed Lucas as a scapegoat. He is the embodiment of foolishness. He wore sunglasses inside, he bragged endlessly, he sounded like a dying cat, and he nearly burned the house down. As the learner watches Lucas fail so spectacularly, they subconsciously compare themselves to him. They realize, I may be struggling immensely to remember not to use the word "to," but at least I possess the baseline competence not to set my kitchen on fire while bragging about my skills.
The humor and the exaggerated incompetence of the fictional character act as a pressure release valve for the learner's own insecurities and makes him feel relatively competent, which lowers their anxiety.
It fundamentally disarms the affective filter. But the true masterstroke is Anna's final validation. But you can speak English, Lucas, and that is great. This is where the curriculum subtly, almost invisibly, breaks the fourth wall.
Because let's be honest about the reality of the situation. Who is actually engaging in the agonizing labor of learning to speak English in that exact moment? It certainly isn't Lucas. Lucas is a static construct of ink and paper. The entity actively learning English is the human being sitting on the other side of the document, the listener.
By having the authoritative character, Anna, validate the foolish character, Lucas, for the specific act of speaking English, the exact difficult activity the listener is currently attempting. The curriculum is executing a proxy validation. It is subtly praising and motivating the learner through the safety of the narrative structure. The fictional character is being celebrated for participating in the lesson, which serves as a psychological mirror, congratulating the real-world learner simply for making the effort to be there.
It is an engineered psychological safety net. It communicates a deeply reassuring message. You are going to make mistakes. You're going to struggle with the grammar. You might metaphorically burn the soup. But the mere act of showing up and attempting to speak English is a victory worthy of celebration. It is profoundly validating. And you would assume, after achieving such a warm, neurochemically beneficial resolution, the curriculum designers would simply end the lesson. Drop the curtain, let the learner bask in the dopamine, and conclude the session.
But the instructional design does not allow for passive consumption. The document pivots sharply one final time.
It does indeed. We immediately transition into the final phase of the document, titled The Talent Show Game. This is an interactive finale structured as a rapid-fire assessment consisting of 4 distinct rounds between Anna and Lukas. The premise is that Anna challenges Lukas with prompts, and he must respond, actively demonstrating his mastery of the rules they have just explored.
This signifies a critical shift in the cognitive demands placed on the learner. We are moving from the passive absorption of a narrative into the active retrieval of data.
Let's dissect the architecture of this game. In rounds 1 and 2, Anna demands direct mechanical translations. She asks, "How do you say, 'I know how to swim'?" Lukas responds, explicitly vocalizing his internal grammar check. "Remember, no 2, I can swim." She follows up by asking how to translate, "I do not know how to dance," and Lukas applies the negative rule, "I cannot dance" or "I can't dance."
These initial rounds are pure procedural assessments. They are testing the analytical rote memorization of the structural rule.
But then, in rounds 3 and 4, the nature of the game completely fractures. Anna abruptly stops asking for grammatical translations. Instead, she begins asking narrative trivia questions based on the story they just lived through. Round 3 asks, "What did Lukas do in the kitchen?" Lukas responds narratively, retrieving the episodic data. "It was a disaster. I cannot cook." And in the climactic round 4, Anna asks, "But what is the one thing Lukas can do very well?" And Lukas delivers the thematic resolution. "I am learning every day. I can speak English."
The sequence of these 4 rounds is not arbitrary. It is meticulously engineered to exploit a specific cognitive phenomenon.
So what does this all mean? I see they are constantly switching the context here at the end, forcing the learner to bounce between grammar drills and story recall. But usually we see that kind of rapid context switching in physical motor skills, like a basketball practice or in complex mathematics. How does applying it to basic language comprehension change the neurological pathways being built?
Yeah, so what you're identifying there is a foundational concept in cognitive science. It's called interleaving, which was heavily researched by cognitive psychologist Robert Bjork. It falls under the umbrella of what Bjork calls desirable difficulties.
Desirable difficulties.
Right. When the average adult attempts to learn a new skill, their instinct is to use blocked practice. They want to study one isolated concept repetitively until it feels fluent, and only then move on to the next concept. In language learning, block practice looks like spending 30 minutes solely doing translation drills, followed by 30 minutes solely reading a story.
Because logically it feels efficient to conquer one vertical pillar before moving to the next?
It feels efficient, and it creates a powerful illusion of competence in the short term. Because the information is simply idling in the brain's short-term working memory, the learner feels incredibly fluent during the drill. But longitudinal research demonstrates that blocked practice leads to catastrophic decay in long-term retention. Your brain essentially goes on autopilot. It stops actively processing the logic because the context never changes. Interleaving, however, disrupts that autopilot. Interleaving forces the learner to rapidly, unpredictably mix different types of cognitive tasks.
It reminds me of athletic training. If a tennis player stands at the baseline and hits 100 identical forehands from a ball machine, they look like a professional by ball 90. But if the machine randomly alternates between a forehand, a backhand volley, and a high lob, the player looks clumsy, but their actual in-game neural response time improves exponentially.
That is the exact biological mechanism at play. Interleaving introduces friction, a desirable difficulty. It forces the brain to continuously clear the working memory, reevaluate the entirely new context of the problem, and actively reconstruct the solution from long-term storage. Let's apply this directly to the talent show game. Rounds 1 and 2 demand rote translation. The learner is utilizing procedural memory pathways, focusing purely on the mechanics of stripping away the word to.
They're engaged in cold, analytical, structural processing.
But the instant round 3 begins, what did Lukas do in the kitchen? That analytical pathway is rendered useless. The brain must violently shift gears. It must now access episodic memory. It has to mentally reconstruct the sensory details of the story, the sound of the alarm, the visual of the black smoke, the emotional resonance of the failure. And only after retrieving that episodic context can it extract the target vocabulary, cannot cook, and deploy it as an answer.
It forces the brain to arrive at the exact same destination, the target vocabulary, but mandates that it travel there using a completely different neurological highway.
Adding another layer to that, by rapidly oscillating between procedural translation and episodic narrative recall, the curriculum forces the brain to weave those disparate highways together. The target vocabulary is no longer a fragile, isolated data point suspended in short-term memory. It becomes a deeply integrated, three-dimensional neurological web. If, in a real-world conversation, the learner suddenly forgets the procedural grammar rule, the episodic memory of the blazing kitchen can serve as a backup retrieval pathway. If the memory of the story fades, the muscle memory of the translation drill remains.
It is the ultimate form of cognitive cross-training. It builds redundancy into the memory architecture.
It does. But observing this methodology, this raises an important question regarding the disparity between how children and adults approach the acquisition of new information.
How does this highlight that disparity?
Well, consider the natural learning state of a child. Children are inherently interleaved learners. They do not segment their days into block practice. They bounce wildly from physical play to attempting to articulate a complex sentence, to failing, to listening to a story, to mimicking an adult, constantly and chaotically mixing contexts. As adults, we systematically train that chaotic adaptability out of ourselves. We crave the sterile predictability of the spreadsheet and the manual. We believe rigid blocks practice is the hallmark of maturity and efficiency. But the architects of this A1 curriculum understand a fundamental biological truth. To truly permanently rewire an adult brain, you cannot simply hand it a list of rules. You must artificially recreate that dynamic, emotionally resonant, multi-contextual environment. You must provide the structural rules, but you must simultaneously provide the theater, the emotional stakes, and the unpredictable cognitive demands.
You essentially have to engineer a scenario that forces the rigid adult brain to remember how to play. Which brings us, perfectly, back to you, the listener, because at the very end of this document, under scenarios, there is a closing call to action. Anna concludes the lesson by asking the student directly, what are your hidden talents? What can you do? Can you swim? Can you play the car? Can you cook better than Lukas? Tell us in the comments. See you next time. Bye.
It's an invitation to participate.
Exactly. It's asking the learner to step up to the mic. And if you extract one overarching philosophy from our deep dive into the architecture of Lesson 60 today, let it be this. Acquiring any genuinely new transformative skill, whether that is mastering a new language, adapting to a complex programming framework, learning to play the cello, or even attempting to restructure how you communicate with your partner, requires an absolute, unflinching willingness to be the Lukas of your own narrative.
You cannot bypass the crucible of incompetence.
You really can't. You have to willingly put on the metaphorical indoor sunglasses. You have to step onto the stage, attempt the performance, and accept the statistical probability that you are going to sound remarkably like a dying cat. You must possess the courage to metaphorically incinerate the meal and trigger the fire alarms, because the relentless pursuit of perfectionism is the absolute enemy of neurological adaptation.
The errors you make are not obstacles impeding the learning process. From a biological standpoint, those errors are the exact mechanism that forces the brain to grow. The emotional friction of failure, the cognitive dissonance of that giant red X, is the necessary signal that triggers synaptic plasticity.
So you have to embrace the disaster, actively work to lower your affective filter, forgive yourself for the clumsy errors, and trust that eventually the smoke will dissipate, the alarm will silence, and you will realize that you actually possess the ability to do the very thing that once seemed impossible. But I want to leave you with one final, lingering thought to dissect on your own, something that the meticulous engineering of this document points toward, but leaves unspoken. We have just spent an hour forensically deconstructing how this A1 lesson relies on heavily structured, rigidly enforced rules, the massive red X annihilating the word to, and a deeply dramatic, emotionally manipulated cautionary tale just to teach a fully developed human adult how to say, I can swim. It requires an astonishing amount of psychological architecture to make a simple concept stick in an adult mind. But reflect for a moment on how we all acquired our first language.
Yeah, that's the real contrast.
When we were infants, we did not have the benefit of explicit grammar rules printed in high contrast colors. We were not provided with structured, moralistic narratives about the consequences of kitchen fires. We simply existed within a chaotic linguistic environment, and we absorbed the most complex communication system on Earth naturally through sheer, unadulterated immersion and millions of chaotic, unjudged iterations of trial and error. If learning a second language as an adult requires such deliberate, heavily engineered narratives to overcome our massive internal resistance and rigid mental pathways, it begs a much larger question. What other natural skills in our adult lives are we currently failing to grasp simply because we haven't discovered the right story to tell ourselves about them? What profound capabilities could we finally master if we just stopped desperately trying to read the sterile instruction manual and finally allowed ourselves to become an active participant in the messy, dramatic, embarrassing story of figuring it out? Think about it. Until next time.